Rushen MHK Michelle Haywood wants to progressively prevent new generations from being able to purchase tobacco products. Her private members bill, which received support in the House of Keys earlier this month, would in effect see the age at which you can buy tobacco products increase by a year each year until eventually nobody could buy them. Dr. Haywood joins me now in the studio. What is your motivation for bringing this forward?
This is something I've been considering for a while, and I actually held off because the vaping bill legislation was coming through, and in my opinion that would have been the ideal time to kind of mop up some of the gaps that I see in our tobacco legislation. That didn't happen. The vaping bill was very focused on under 18s getting hold of vapes and how to stop that and what to do about it. So the minister considered that there wasn't scope to include the extra measures that I wanted in that, and I did indicate at the time that I'd bring it forward privately if nothing happened. But I think really it's just that tobacco companies have innovated beyond our legislation at the moment. So there are several things that we cover in our legislation, including snuff, which isn't currently a very large use of tobacco, but what we don't talk about are things like snus, which are the little pouches of tobacco that you can tuck into your cheek and absorb the various chemicals through your skin. And so we haven't kept up with that, so it means that there are no age restrictions on some of those products.
Many people will recognise that smoking has been fairly harmful to people's health, and there are lots of campaigns to discourage people from smoking. What's wrong with just carrying on along that route of actively discouraging people, telling them what the harms are, and then leaving them with the choice as to whether they wish to do this or not?
I think one of the things is we've known about smoking harms now for 70 years. If you try to introduce tobacco into commerce today, and if you tried to bring it on as a new product to the market, it would be banned instantly. But the big issue you have is the nicotine addiction that comes with it, and nicotine in itself is very, very addictive and drives those repeat behaviours. It's not what causes health problems down the line. So nicotine isn't a carcinogen, but there are lots of other things in tobacco that are. And what we've seen is a gradual decline in tobacco usage. That's true. We seem to have stabilised. That rate of decline has been getting less, and the decline's been brought around, you're right, by education and then by taxation as well. We heavily tax as a discouragement. But what we're seeing now is that the tobacco companies have put their backing into alternative methods of delivering you a nicotine hit, so vapes, for example. And we're seeing children who have never smoked taking up vapes, and then they move on to smoking, and so vaping has actually become a way of building a nicotine addiction, and then they move into smoking, and we're starting to see in young people that rate of cigarette smoking is starting to rise for the first time in decades. And it's in my view, it's a cynical ploy by the tobacco companies. Vape companies, when they started out, were independent, and they've all been taken over by tobacco companies, or tobacco companies have set up their own vapes, and it's all about keeping you addicted to nicotine. So I think my big problem here is not necessarily what the method of delivery is. It's that we're allowing companies to feed an addictive product.
So why not then just ban smoking tobacco products? Why not just go down that route?
So, well, the bill is set in three parts, basically, is what I was proposing. One is to put age restrictions on the tobacco products that we don't currently restrict, because there's a number of them now coming onto the market. There's heated tobacco isn't covered properly, the little snooze packets and things like that. The second part is to say, well, nicotine products should always be a restricted product, because until the vaping bill came in, we had nothing that indicated, nothing that said there was an age restriction on those. And good retailers were restricting it anyway, but there are lots of other nicotine delivery methods that we have no control over. So that's the second part. And then the third part really came about because of what New Zealand had done, and lots of work that was done in England as well, they were looking to a smoke-free generation, was saying put this generational ban in and say to all the under 18s who can't currently buy tobacco products, you will never be able to buy tobacco products, and to break that cycle of addiction and harms. And the benefits come somewhere down the line. We know that smoking harms, it's 30 years or so before they really come to medical attention. But we know that early uptake of of nicotine sets in place basically a lifelong addiction that is really, really hard to break.
Assuming that we'd banned tobacco smoking, cigarettes and cigars in particular, assuming all that's banned, what is the health problem associated with vaping? What is that?
So first, it's a ban on sales of these things. It's not a ban on possessing them or using them. I'm not intending that the vaping bill actually criminalises 16 and 17-year-olds for possession of vapes. Nothing I'm suggesting is going to do that. It's not a ban on doing it. It's just a ban on sale. So prohibition on sale rather than trying to criminalise anyone for what their addiction is and what their needs are. There's a lot of science now about the impact of nicotine, especially on the developing brain. So up to the age of 25, 26, when the brain is still fairly plastic and still moulding itself into an adult brain, it affects concentration, it affects learning, it affects memory, it affects mood and behaviour. And some of those changes that get set in by early addiction into nicotine become hardwired into the brain. And so you're actually losing that brain's ability to develop by allowing young people particularly to access nicotine. It also increases their risk that they'll become addicted to other substances somewhere in their lives because you've created those addiction pathways in their brain.
Another drug, of course, that some people have become addicted to over many centuries is alcohol. You didn't have any thoughts in relation to that, or is that too ingrained in our culture and society?
One step at a time. And alcohol, I think, is obviously ingrained into our society. And I think if you start looking at the harms of alcohol, obviously there is work to be done around reducing those harms. But there are lots of people who consume small amounts of alcohol on a semi-regular or irregular basis, and for which there is no long-term harm associated with that. So I think we're in kind of different leagues in terms of harm. We know that smoking causes between 12 and 15% of all deaths that we'll experience, and so in our community that's a signal. That's over 100, probably about 120, 130 people a year that we lose because of the health effects of smoking. So we can see there's a clear gain there in terms of having a population in the future that isn't addicted to smoking, hasn't experienced years of exposure to all the harmful chemicals that are in those delivery methods, whether it's tobacco products or and the evidence is really not clear over vapes. All of the flavours that we put into vapes are actually food flavours. They've been tested for safety if you ingest them, not if you vaporise them and inhale them into your lungs. And there's some significant concerns growing over links between promoting asthma and all sorts of things in terms of what's going into your lungs. And we really don't have that focus on how do you keep your lung tissue as healthy as you should for as long as we can.
You're a member of Treasury. You mentioned this earlier. We've educated and taxed people away from tobacco consumption. Presumably your colleagues in Treasury will have some level of concern that if you are successful and you ban the sale of tobacco products, then you're going to lose out on the tax.
We went through that in some detail, and I'm really grateful to sort of parliamentary colleagues in England. They've done an amazing impact assessment on what the measures would look like there, and it's very easy to extrapolate from a lot of their work. So the upper estimate is it's about £300,000 of tax for each year of young people that we stop taking up smoking. That's what we'd use.
300,000 on the island?
300,000 on the island, but you'd lose that, of course, over a rolling period of years. So you'd lose £300,000 every year for the next, we estimated 50 years. We decided smokers generally have shorter life expectancies. So between 18 and being about 68, 70, you'd lose just that income each year.
So in 50 years' time, we'd be losing £15 million a year.
No, we'd have lost £300,000 each year. So you'd lose overall. You lose about £19 million of tax, but we'd be losing it incrementally. Right. So in terms of your annual budgets,
you don't just lose it once. You lose it every year that you're not getting
every year that you're not collecting it. Yeah. But you'll gain the health benefits back. And so the estimate has been that it costs us twice as much to treat smoking-related illnesses within the health system as we collect in taxation. And then there are the other costs, they're almost the hidden costs of that. So the the disability and the illness that it causes, and people stopping work prematurely and having to claim benefits early, and the loss of members of families, way earlier than they should have gone. All of those sort of hidden costs to society add up onto that as well.
You very quickly brushed over that the benefit was the reduced health cost. What are the obvious benefits? What are the costs that are going to be saved by this?
So we know, for example, that smoking causes a fairly high risk of heart attacks. It's associated with increased strokes, clotting, pulmonary embolism, various thrombosis-related injuries as well. So the estimated cost in the UK is that smoking could cost up to a quarter of the health budget, treating smoking-related illnesses, and smoking exacerbating other illnesses as well. And so that's a significant sum of money. But of course, you only gain that as the population doesn't take it up. You only gain that by stealth over years. So you won't see an immediate impact on, if we prohibit the sale of items tomorrow, you're not going to see those gains for maybe 5, 6, 10, maybe 15 years. And it is a long-term plan to say, actually, this is how you reduce that demand on health services, by reducing the harms that are going in.
And of course, the other thing that you aren't, or you can't have no control over, is whether people then decide, instead of, if they can't smoke, they'll go on to something else, use some other products. I don't know, eat too much fatty and sugary foods. They'll drink more alcohol, whatever it may be. So the saving may be generated in terms of the harms of tobacco, but you don't know, are you going to then transplant that over onto something else?
Yeah, no, it's a big thing. What would you divert people onto? And the other challenge has been, do you create some sort of black market of sales where people are willing to buy them and sell them to underage? I think you can only do so much. There's small steps, and obviously trying to reduce those harms, it's going to be lots of things. I know we've had discussions, because we're into a bill committee now, we've had discussions there about what's the rate of education and support, and how do we actually help people step away from addictive nicotine products. How do we support that? And we think it's probably not well supported. It's the service is good, but we know that there's fairly high demand on it already. I think the other thing that this sends, though, is an indicator to people that actually it's probably not okay. And I think there is that psychological impact. So I think there will be people who, even if they currently do take tobacco or use nicotine products, that they'll think, well, actually there's signals being sent here that it's not really acceptable. And I think that increases the kind of the pressure, if we can up the support for people to give up.
Of course, if we did this in isolation, it would be the fears about a black market in tobacco products would be pretty legitimate, because we would have all our neighbours still allowing tobacco to be sold legally. So it would be impossible, wouldn't it, to do that in isolation for the Isle of Man?
I'm not sure that it's impossible necessarily. You can see that there are places that you can travel in the world. If you go to the States, for example, where the alcohol laws are different from one state to the next. If you travel across a border, suddenly one state you could buy alcohol at the age of 18, and the next state is 21, and you just accept. And I think, because I'm not seeking, we're not talking about possession or anything like that. There's no criminalisation in this. It's just a restriction on sales. You would find things like, I guess when I was a kid, we went on trips to France and we bought firecrackers over there, because we could buy firecrackers in France and we bring them back with us. But you maybe see some of that cross-border thing. But if you were a visitor coming to the Isle of Man and you were, say, 20 years old, and the Isle of Man had got to an age restriction that meant you couldn't buy tobacco here, you'd bring it with you. If that was what you needed to do, it'd be like travelling with your prescription meds or whatever, you'd bring stuff with you. So I'm not sure it does drive a big, because this is not a prohibition on possession, I don't think it does drive a big thing. But equally, the UK have signalled, the Labour Party was supporting the tobacco and vapes bill that was going through there. That's gone through committee now. There's been some amendments to it, and they've indicated that they will bring it back as soon as possible. And for them, it's a piece of legislation that's almost ready to go. So you can see early in administration, that's something they're likely to pick up and just run with. So it would be weird to put us out of step with the UK, and I agree with that. I think when I picked the date that I suggested on my bill, it was on the basis of how could I progress this through our Parliament. And we pride ourselves on being quick to legislate when we see that we need to. So I picked a timing that fitted with how Tynwald works. The UK came forward with theirs. They said a year later. I'm not, if there's another year of children that can take up smoking, that's unfortunate. It'll be on my conscience, but actually, if what I need to do politically to get it through is to say, fine, we'll align with the UK, then that's where I'm happy to go. And we've talked in committee about having an appointed day order that basically would allow that to be brought in, that clause, if we agree, it to be brought in at the same time as the UK's, should they bring theirs in.
And you could specifically design our legislation with an eye to whenever the UK legislation was introduced.
And their tobacco and vaping bill is very different. It creates licences for vaping shops, and then you have to apply for the licence, you have to pay for your licence, etc. It sets up a whole regulatory regime. Mine is much more light touch. The OFT already deal with age-restricted products. This is just putting in a different poster that says, instead of we're not selling it to under 18s, we're not selling it to you if you were born after this date. It's not a big change. And in terms of enforcement, the OFT said, actually, £20,000 over a couple of years, and that should get them running on this one. So I don't think they were concerned. So there are some differences, but we could actually, create the bill so that it switches on. And it would be really odd for us to look at our Westminster neighbours and say, well, actually, they value young people not being dragged into a nicotine addiction, and we don't. I think that would look out of step as well. I know there are differences between us and across for various different things, age of driving, for example, but actually on a health issue, it would seem really, really out of kilter to say we don't value our young people as much as they do.
Any moves in Ireland in this regard?
There have been discussions in Ireland. I don't think there's any bill coming forward yet. So I've been keeping an eye on that. I know Scotland had discussed it at length, and I think everyone's been looking to. Originally, New Zealand started on this, which was a really bold move, but a change of regime over there, and the incoming government said we can't afford the tax loss. Speaking to the Treasury, as I obviously have done here, we see the tax loss as a kind of a gain in health elsewhere, and yes, it disappears off one bit of your balance sheet, but it'll reappear elsewhere in multiples.
I mean, you alluded there to Treasury and your a recent addition to the Treasury family. Treasury does have that reputation, doesn't it, of seeing very firmly the cost of a thing and the loss in terms of income, and often overlooks the actual benefit to society of a particular proposal. Are you going to be a new broom in Treasury to try and discourage that I don't know, to use Chris Robertshaw's term, that silo mentality of just focusing on the money rather than the potential policy benefit?
Yeah, I think you have to be really careful, don't you, not to be sucked into it, understanding the cost of something but not necessarily the value of it. When I set out to Treasury all of the these are the costs I could see associated with this, and these are the savings I can see associated with this, and timelines, and obviously I evidenced it and worked my way through, and I presented what I thought was quite a comprehensive discussion. Obviously, it's my bill, so I'm excluded from the room at the point where it gets discussed by the Treasury Board, which is only right. They've obviously appreciated the arguments I've put forward. And I think one of the things that frustrates me about politics generally is there is always a tendency to look short term. So you're right, Treasury could take the short term view and say, we're going to lose this amount of money because people didn't take up smoking in this year and we didn't get the tax duty. But to look long term and say, but these are the savings I will make in 20 or 30 years' time. I won't be around in 20 or 30 years' time to see those savings. and Treasury's trying to balance the budget now, and so you have to be quite clear about constructing your pros and cons and which way that balance goes, and not to be afraid to say this won't benefit us now, but it does in the long term. And my frustration with dealing with climate change is we've known about it for 30 years. Politicians have a short shelf life. You're not going to do anything in your 5-year term that makes you really, really unpopular because you won't get re-elected. But actually, the decisions we take over climate change will be having an impact in 15, 20 years' time. And that's what we need to be brave to do. And I think the same applies to this. There has to come a point where you say there are long-term implications for decisions we take now, and you're recognising those rather than just focusing on the short term.
One of my regrets as housing minister was that I wasn't able to persuade Treasury of the benefit of passive housing. We went and said, actually, we've got these housing schemes that we're hoping to deliver. Surely they should all be passive house. And we knew this was going to cost, I don't know, maybe 20% more in terms of short-term capital cost, but passive housing basically means that the tenants don't have to pay anything towards their heating bills. It made loads of economic sense. Sadly, the Treasury looked at the additional capital cost and said, no, we can't do that. And as far as I'm aware, we've still only got 4 government-owned passive houses built on the island.
Yeah, and it's absolute... It's almost scandalous, isn't it, that failure to think and to plan long term, and to say sometimes the benefits are not what comes back on the bottom of I was going to say the government's profit and loss account, but it's not what comes back on that bottom line. It's those savings down the line. And passive housing would have lifted social housing residents out of fuel poverty because you just would have taken those costs away from them. And we've started to see a move towards that now. But it's slow, and you're right. Decisions should be taken that do benefit future and generations, and you look towards what are you trying to create in the future. Now, you imagine an island where we'd done that. We wouldn't be investing in things like the green energy scheme and things and trying to desperately go back and re-insulate homes if actually the houses that we've been constructing for the last 15 years had been following that approach. And it's always difficult trying to balance costs. The island's noted for its gold standard approach to pretty much everything it tries to construct, and not necessarily working out what's value for money. But it's I hope that people can look on a more long-term basis.
A couple of final points then. The first one is how do people feed back? Obviously, there will be some sort of consultation on this. You've got your committee now. One of the things that you're proposing in Tynwald this week is to allow private members' bills to appear on the government consultation hub. There is a difference between Parliament and government, isn't there? Are you at all concerned that you would be mixing the two up here?
I fully appreciate there's a difference between Parliament and government. I don't think for most of our residents on the island they give two hoots about the distinction between Parliament and government. So what we have currently is a consultation hub that's paid for by taxpayers' money. The government have got the licence for that. There's tabs on there for putting government consultations. In the past, private members' bills have run through there. There's a separate tab for the Department of Health, and I'm not sure why that is. I don't know why that's not rolled in with government consultations, but that's another thing. But actually for Tynwald, which also gets its funding from taxpayers' money, so we're funding this out of the same pot, to go and buy a separate licence to run the same piece of software effectively from the same company, but just with a Tynwald badge on the top, just seems to me to be a waste of funds. It's a waste of several £1,000s a year for what would be maybe a couple of private members' bills and some parliamentary questionnaires coming through, maybe 2 or 3 of those a year. Absolutely outrageous to suggest that we should go and buy another licence. All it needs on that government consultation hub is a tab that says, and this is the Tynwald consultation part of it. There's no reason why it couldn't work within the same site. And then what you get is that it's a trusted site that people already respond to, and we know that they do. You're not directing anyone to a member's own website to go and take part in some consultation or survey. The data is handled in a very sort of specific way. We know it's all secure. We know the privacy notices are good. We know it's all GDPR compliant. And when the data comes out, there's a basic analysis that's done that can't be influenced by the member who set it up. So you don't have members being accused of manipulating the data or anything like that. There's a clear, secure process for collecting it. And it just seems to me absolutely daft that we're not allowing it. And trying to kind of pin this down on the distinction between government and parliament, most people don't care, to be fair. We're all one entity. We are the people who make the decisions about how the island runs and which hat we all wear different hats at times. There are times I'm part of government, there are times I'm part of parliament. We all wear different hats during that. And it just seems absolutely ludicrous not to do this as a shared resource, in the same way that my payslip comes through government payroll. I use the government email address. GTS support my use of technology, so Tynwald was already using government resources. So I don't actually see it as a problem, but I do see it as a problem not having that route for private members' bills.
A good old bit of Tynwald pragmatism then.
Well, yeah, we keep talking about we've got to be careful with spending and we've got to be careful with costs, and this would just seem, in a very small way, a really sensible, logical way of doing it.
That was Rushen MHK Michelle Haywood. So what do you think? Should people have a right to buy products which are proven to cause serious damage to their health? If this move is successfully introduced, what other harmful pleasures will be targeted? I'm Phil Gaughan, Goramayo. Thanks for listening.